The restaurant was buzzing with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter. It was the kind of place where well-dressed professionals gathered after work, where the scent of freshly grilled steak and expensive wine filled the air. At a corner table, a man in a wheelchair struggled to balance a tray in his lap. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to maneuver it without spilling his drink. The effort was evident, every small movement required intense focus. Across the room, a woman in a sleek designer dress sat with a group of colleagues, laughing over cocktails. She had been watching him, her eyes narrowing with amusement. Then, just as the man's fork slipped from his tray and clattered onto the floor, she let out a sharp laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh meant to lighten the mood. It was mocking, cruel. Several heads turned. A few customers looked away, pretending not to notice. The staff hesitated, uncertain if they should intervene. But the woman didn't stop. "Why even bother trying?" she said loudly, shaking her head. "I mean, seriously, just ask for help if you can't do something. It's embarrassing." The disabled man froze. He didn't look up immediately. Instead, he carefully set his tray down, adjusting the wheels of his chair before meeting her gaze. And when he did, something changed. His expression wasn't hurt. It wasn't angry. It was calm. Unreadable. Almost knowing. The woman's smirk wavered. She had expected embarrassment, maybe even frustration. But not this. The man's lips parted slightly, and in a quiet, steady voice, he spoke. "It's funny, isn't it? Watching someone struggle?" The words landed like a weight in the air. For the first time, the woman felt uncomfortable. Before she could respond, a waiter suddenly tripped, knocking over a glass of water, right onto her lap. She gasped, jumping up, furious. "Are you kidding me? This dress is worth more than your salary." The waiter apologized repeatedly, scrambling to clean up the mess. But the man in the wheelchair just watched her. And then, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was knowing. Unshaken. "Life has a strange way of balancing things," he said simply. The woman felt a shiver creep down her spine. She grabbed her purse, ready to storm out of the restaurant. But as she walked past the man, he spoke again, this time, in a voice so low only she could hear. "I hope you never find yourself in my position. But life has a way of teaching us the lessons we refuse to learn." The words followed her long after she left the restaurant. And that night, alone in the dim glow of her luxury apartment, she would hear something in the dark. A whisper. Her own name. But she was alone. Or so she thought. The sound of high heels clicking against the pavement echoed in the dimly lit parking lot. The woman clutched her designer purse a little tighter, her earlier confidence fading as an eerie silence settled around her. She had laughed at the man in the wheelchair. Mocked him. Yet, his words stuck to her like an invisible weight. "I hope you never find yourself in my position. But life has a way of teaching us the lessons we refuse to learn." She shook her head, annoyed. "Why did I let that get to me?" With a sigh, she approached her luxury sedan and pulled out her keys. The car refused to unlock. Frowning, she pressed the button again. Still nothing. Then, from the shadows of the empty lot, a whisper slithered through the air. Her name. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Just an empty parking lot. But as she turned back to her car, her heart stopped. There it was. A wheelchair, sitting just a few feet away. No one was in it. No one was even nearby. Yet, somehow, it was facing her. A cold chill ran down her spine. This wasn't right. Her hands fumbled with her phone as she tried to call someone, anyone. But before she could dial, the screen glitched and went black. Panic crept in. The wind picked up, carrying a faint, familiar voice. "Funny, isn't it?" she gasped. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She turned and ran, leaving her expensive car behind. But as she fled, the sound of something rolling behind her sent a fresh wave of terror through her body. The wheelchair was moving. By itself. She sprinted down the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop until she reached her apartment building, fumbling with her keys, heart pounding in her chest. When she finally got inside and locked the door, she leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. This isn't real. This is just my imagination. I'm just tired. But deep down, she knew something was very, very wrong. As she walked into her bedroom and turned on the light, her reflection in the mirror made her scream. Because behind her, just over her shoulder, stood the disabled man from the restaurant, smiling. The scream ripped through the apartment, echoing off the cold, pristine walls. She spun around, heart slamming against her ribs, but no one was there. The room was empty. Silent. Her reflection still stared back at her, but the man, he was gone. Her breaths came in short, panicked bursts. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady herself. I didn't see him. I couldn't have. This is stress. That's all. She forced herself to take deep breaths, rationalizing the situation. Maybe the lights played tricks on me. Maybe I'm just exhausted. Deciding she needed rest, she climbed into bed, wrapping herself in silk sheets. But sleep didn't come easily. Because in the darkness, just as she was about to drift off, a sound filled the room. A slow, deliberate creaking. Like the sound of wheels rolling across a wooden floor. Her eyes snapped open. The room was still. But something felt off. She pulled the covers up to her chin, her body frozen in place, ears straining for any sign of movement. And then, her phone lit up on the nightstand. A single message blinked on the screen. Funny, isn't it? Her breath hitched. Hands trembling, she grabbed the phone and stared at the sender. No number. No name. Just empty space. She threw the phone across the room and shot out of bed. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run. But just as she reached for the doorknob, the door opened by itself. And on the floor, right in front of her, was something that made her stomach drop. A wheelchair. The same one from the parking lot. Her vision blurred, panic clawing at her chest. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. Then, her phone rang. The screen was still shattered from when she threw it, but the caller ID was clear. Unknown caller. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. The ringing stopped. And a second later, a voice message appeared. Hand shaking, she pressed play. A voice whispered through the speaker. Slow. Calm. Familiar. I told you, life has a way of teaching lessons. And yours has just begun. The blood in her veins ran ice cold. She grabbed her coat and bolted out of the apartment, leaving everything behind. But the moment she stepped outside, she noticed something strange. The streets were empty. Too empty. No people. No cars. No sound. It was as if she had stepped into a different world. A world where she was suddenly, completely alone. And then, in the distance, a man in a wheelchair was waiting. Waiting for her. The cold night air pressed against her skin as she stumbled onto the empty street. Her heels clicked against the pavement, each step echoing in the silence. She clutched her coat tightly, eyes scanning the desolate roads. No cars. No pedestrians. Not even a single streetlight flickering. The city, her city, was gone. The only thing that remained was the figure in the wheelchair, watching her from a distance. She took a step back. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body felt frozen. Then, the wheelchair started rolling forward. But the man in it wasn't moving his hands. It was as if something invisible was pushing him closer. Her heart pounded. This isn't real. This isn't real. She turned on her heel and ran, sprinting through the empty streets, desperate to escape. But the moment she turned a corner, she was back where she started. The man in the wheelchair was still there. Still waiting. Still smiling. A chill slithered down her spine. This was impossible. Then, a voice whispered behind her ear. "It's funny, isn't it?" She screamed, spinning around, but no one was there. Her breathing was erratic now, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She needed help. Someone had to be out there. She dialed her best friend's number. The call rang once, then twice, then an unfamiliar static filled the line. Then, a voice. Not her friend's. "Help you? You never helped anyone." Her stomach twisted in terror. She hung up and bolted into the nearest building, an all-night convenience store. Or at least, it used to be. The shelves were empty. The coolers were dark. The security cameras were unplugged. It looked abandoned, as if no one had stepped foot inside for years. Then, a faint sound. Something rolling over the tile floor. She turned her head slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. A wheelchair was inside the store now. But this time, no one was sitting in it. It moved on its own. Rolling toward her. She stumbled backward, knocking over shelves as panic clawed at her mind. She had to get out. She turned to run. And slammed straight into something solid. A man in a wheelchair. The same man. Up close now, his face wasn't quite right. His eyes were too dark, his expression too still. "Still think it's funny?" he whispered. The world around her shifted. The lights in the store flickered violently. The walls seemed to stretch as if reality itself was warping. Then, she felt it. Her legs gave out. Her knees hit the tile floor hard, sending pain shooting up her spine. And when she tried to stand, she couldn't. Her legs didn't work. Terror exploded in her chest. No. No, this isn't happening. She grabbed at the counter, trying to pull herself up, but her lower body refused to respond. The man in the wheelchair tilted his head, watching. Then he said 3 words that made her blood run cold. "Now it's your turn." The world faded into darkness. She woke up gasping for air. Her hands clutched at the ground beneath her, cold pavement. The scent of damp concrete and garbage filled her nose. A distant siren wailed, but it sounded far away. She tried to move. Her arms responded. Her head turned. But her legs? Nothing. A sharp panic sliced through her chest. She tried again, willing her body to obey. Still nothing. Terror gripped her as she looked down. Her legs lay lifeless beneath her. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real. Her breathing turned shallow as her fingers trembled against the rough pavement. No. No, this can't be happening. She forced herself to focus. Maybe I just hit my legs. Maybe the feeling will come back. But deep down, she knew. It wouldn't. A shadow passed over her. She looked up. A man in a business suit stood nearby, scrolling through his phone. Relief flooded her. "Excuse me, sir. Please. I need help." The man didn't look up. She called louder. "I can't move, I need help, please." Nothing. He stepped around her like she was invisible and kept walking. Her heart pounded. Another person passed, a woman in jogging gear. She didn't even glance in her direction. People walked by as if she wasn't even there. Like she was nothing. Her stomach twisted. This is what it feels like. The humiliation burned through her, hotter than any embarrassment she had ever felt. She had mocked a disabled man in a restaurant, and now she was trapped in the very nightmare she had laughed at. Her body felt small, insignificant, forgotten. Tears burned her eyes. She tried to drag herself forward, her hands scraping against the pavement. No one stopped to help. No one even looked. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a cruel laugh, her own, echoing from that night in the restaurant. And suddenly, she understood. This is what it was like. This is what he felt. She looked up, and froze. A wheelchair sat across the street, waiting. And standing behind it, was him. The man she had laughed at. His dark eyes met hers. And then, he turned and walked away. The pain of being ignored burned deeper than she thought possible. She had always been the center of attention, her presence commanded rooms, her voice demanded respect. But now? She was nothing. People walked past without a second glance. She called for help, but no one listened. Her hands ached as she dragged herself along the pavement, struggling to move her lifeless legs. She reached for a storefront window to pull herself up, but her reflection stopped her cold. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Her once flawless hair was matted and tangled. The expensive dress she had worn earlier? Torn, filthy. The confident smirk she had once carried? Replaced by wide, desperate eyes. She looked like someone she had pitied. Like someone she had judged. A deep, sickening realization began to settle in her chest. This is what it's like. The disabled man's words echoed in her head. I hope you never find yourself in my position. But life has a way of teaching us the lessons we refuse to learn. Tears pricked her eyes. She had never truly understood suffering, not until now. Then, a voice behind her. Do you understand now? Her body tensed. She turned her head slowly, and saw him. The man in the wheelchair. Except, he wasn't in a wheelchair anymore. He stood before her, tall, strong, walking. Her breath caught. How? He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, eyes filled with something calm but unreadable. You thought your strength made you powerful, he said. But strength isn't measured by how much you can do alone, it's measured by how you treat those who can't. She swallowed hard, shame washing over her. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. She closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. He was right. She had mocked people like him. Looked down on them. Laughed at their struggles. And now, she was one of them. Please, she whispered, voice trembling. Please, help me. For the first time, she asked instead of demanded. And for the first time, she truly meant it. The man tilted his head, considering her. Then, he said something that sent chills through her body. Not yet. And with that, he walked away. Leaving her trapped in the nightmare she had created for herself. She lay there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and regret. She had learned her lesson, but the cost was higher than she could have imagined. What now? Was there a way to undo this? Could she truly redeem herself, or was she trapped in this new reality forever? In the deep silence of the streets, the man's words continued to echo in her mind. Not yet. Not yet. The phrase haunted her. It was a reminder that redemption wasn't a simple fix, it wasn't a magic word or a gesture. It was earned. She stared at the empty street, the echo of distant footsteps the only sound. Her body was still, but her mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to make up for all she had done. Then, she heard something, soft, quiet, but unmistakable. A wheelchair. Her head snapped up. It was him again. But this time, he wasn't looking at her with contempt. His gaze was softer, almost knowing. "You've been here before," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've faced the pain. The struggle. But now you have to make a choice. Are you ready to learn what it really means to be kind?" She didn't hesitate. She nodded. The man in the wheelchair approached her slowly. "I can help you," he said quietly. "But first, you have to understand this, helping yourself comes from helping others. You can't just take. You can't just be selfish and expect the world to give you back what you want." She closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling deep within her. "I understand," she whispered. "I do. I've been given the lesson. But now I need to do something with it." He smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Good. That's all I needed to hear." With that, he turned away and began to roll back into the darkness. But before he disappeared, he spoke one last time. "Redemption isn't about fixing your mistakes, it's about what you do after you realize them." As the wheelchair rolled away, the streets felt less empty. The silence was no longer oppressive. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she could move. Her legs twitched. Slowly at first, but they moved. The feeling returned. She stood up, wobbling at first, then steadying herself. But instead of running back to her apartment, instead of trying to fix everything for herself, she turned. She headed down the street. Toward the next person who needed help. And this time, when she offered assistance, she wasn't just going through the motions. She truly understood what it meant to help. The days passed slowly. Each one felt like a new opportunity to right the wrongs she had committed. She wasn't sure what kind of life she was supposed to lead now, what kind of person she was supposed to be, but she knew one thing for certain: she had to make up for her past. She helped strangers on the street, people with heavy bags, mothers with strollers, the elderly struggling to walk. Each time, she felt a small but significant change within herself. It wasn't easy, and sometimes, she felt like the world wasn't noticing her efforts. But something deep within her had shifted. She wasn't doing these things to gain anyone's approval anymore. She was doing them because it felt right. Her legs had fully recovered, she could walk now, just like before. But now, the physical movement didn't matter so much. It was the emotional journey that mattered. One day, as she sat in a quiet park, watching children play, an elderly woman approached her. The woman had a shopping bag in her hand, and she stopped in front of her, a smile on her face. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice soft, "could you help me carry these bags to my car?" The woman's face was warm with kindness, but it wasn't just the smile that made her heart swell, it was the expectation in her voice. The woman wasn't asking her to help, she was counting on her. Without a second thought, she stood up and grabbed the woman's bags, helping her to the car. As she walked beside the woman, she felt the weight of her past slowly lifting. She wasn't the person she used to be, the one who had laughed at those in need, who had looked down on others from her high pedestal. No, now she was the person who gave. The person who showed compassion. The person who, no matter how small the gesture, took responsibility for making the world a little better. But then, just as the woman opened her car door, the man from the wheelchair appeared again. This time, he didn't stand behind her. He wasn't looming in the background. He was right in front of her, smiling in a way that felt like a silent nod of approval. "You've learned," he said softly. "I have," she replied, her voice steady. "I think I've finally learned." He nodded once, as if confirming what he had known all along. Then, his gaze softened. Good. But remember, redemption is not an end, it's a journey. Don't stop just because you think you've done enough. There's always more to give, more to learn. And the real test will be when it gets hard, when it's tempting to go back to the person you were. That's when you'll truly know if you've changed. Her heart swelled with gratitude, but also with a deep understanding of what he was saying. It wasn't over. The road to redemption was long, and it would be full of challenges. But she was ready for it. She would never stop learning. I won't forget, she whispered. And as the man turned to leave, she felt something incredibly powerful stirring inside her. For the first time in her life, she was free. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. She found herself living in a new way, one she hadn't even thought possible before. The lessons she had learned were still fresh, but now, they had become part of who she was. She no longer acted out of guilt or a need for validation. She did it because she truly understood the value of helping others, of standing alongside those who needed it. It wasn't always easy. There were days when she felt like giving up, when the world felt too overwhelming. But she never did. She kept moving forward. She kept offering her hand to those who needed it. One afternoon, while sitting in the same park where it all started, she saw an elderly man struggling to carry a heavy load of groceries. Instinctively, she stood up. This time, there was no hesitation. She walked up to him, offered to help, and gently took the bags from his hands. As they walked together toward his home, he shared stories from his youth, about how things were different in his time, and how he wished people cared more for one another. And as she listened, a deep sense of fulfillment filled her chest. She realized that she wasn't just helping people with groceries, with tasks, or with simple kindness. She was helping them feel seen, something she had never truly understood before. At that moment, she realized something else too. She was no longer the person who laughed at others' struggles. She was no longer the one who judged or looked down on anyone. She was the person who made others feel like they mattered, who saw their pain and didn't turn away. That was the lesson she had learned, the one that had been painfully carved into her soul. Helping wasn't just about making things easier for someone else. It was about making them feel human. Valuable. She walked the elderly man to his door and handed him the bags. He smiled at her, grateful, but the expression on his face wasn't just one of thanks. There was something deeper, something unspoken. As she turned to leave, she heard his voice call out. "Thank you, young lady. You made my day. It's people like you that give me hope for the future." Those words stayed with her. She hadn't known, in the beginning, how deeply she would affect someone. How her small actions would resonate in ways she couldn't even imagine. She had learned what it meant to truly be a part of the world. To not just take from it, but to give back, to lift others up instead of pushing them down. And she knew, in that moment, that her journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, she stood there for a while, letting the peaceful silence wash over her. And she smiled. Because she finally understood. Life wasn't about having more, it was about giving more.